Hey BookTube, it's Angie. Today I want to talk about historical bad women throughout history. I have a few books here to get the conversation started. I will try not to move too much in my desk chair here. I have kind of an old creaky desk chair. It's comfy, it's just the spring on it is kind of old, so it makes loud creak every so often when you move it a certain way. I haven't gotten around to replacing the gear and stuff in it. I'm sorry if that makes a noise, and I will try to edit it out the best I can. I have a couple of history books, a graphic novel, and then a couple of short novels, I think, to go over. Starting with the history books, I have Bad Girls by Jan Stradling, and this is a nonfiction history book. But the nice thing about this is it's good if you're just getting into history. Obviously we're taught to study history in school, but being taught it and having an interest in it are clearly two different things. So sometimes it takes people longer to get into it. Some people don't get into it when they're in school. It comes to them later in life. And I've heard from a lot of booktubers recently that they are starting to develop an interest in actual history and historical fiction, but are a little scared about where to start, or if it's going to be too complicated or too fact heavy or something like that. So this is a good place to start for that, because all of the women in here, I mean, they all have really interesting stories, because they're all sort of, they're not all the women in here are necessarily blatantly evil. Some of them are what I would kind of say more like victims of circumstance. They were thrust into positions where they had to make really difficult choices, and maybe they made the wrong choices and that deemed them bad girls. But then there are also women who are definitely messed up women, but their life story is still really interesting to read, even though it will make you sit there and go, what? So this one is good because all of the sections in here are really small, broken down pieces, so it's not overwhelming. If you're not that familiar with history, you can take these a little bit at a time. I think the majority of the sections in here, a lot of them are only like 2 or 3 pages. Some of them, the longer ones, run maybe like 5 or 6 pages, and there's a ton of illustrations in here. And you know, if you're like me and you're a fan of French flaps, this is a French flap book. It's really nicely designed, has a cloth binding here. But let me go over some of the women that are in here. Jan Stradling covers a lot of your basics, a lot of the ones that people talk about all the time, like Cleopatra, Boudica, Mary I, King Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth Bathory, the lady who was famous for bathing herself in blood to try to retain her youth, Catherine of Russia, Belle Starr, the female outlaw. They also talk about Mata Hari and Madame Mao, Imelda Marcos. That's one thing I do like about this, is it starts in early, like Roman times, and then goes all the way through up to more modern history. So you get a little bit from each era. She also brings in a few names that maybe don't come up quite as often. Messalina, the Roman empress. There's Rana Valona, in here she names her the Mad Monarch of Madagascar. There's Shi Zhangzhu, the female pirate. Amy Bach, New Zealand's cross-dressing con woman. Georgia Tan, Tennessee's stealer and seller of babies. Just talks about Typhoid Mary in here. Yeah, a lot of different women covered in here. Another thing I like about this is it's really nicely illustrated. Sometimes when you get actual history books, like if you go to Barnes & Noble or something like that and look for them, actual history books can be damn expensive, especially if you get highly illustrated ones. So this one is really nice if you're interested in building your actual history collection. I will say that these are not by any means full bios of these women. They're more like just quick overviews to kind of get you interested in their stories and maybe entice you to go out and get actual bios and books about them that cover them more extensively. This is just sort of a sampler of these women. But like I said, really nicely illustrated. That's a full page painting of Cleopatra. I'll show you some of the other ones in here. They got Catherine of Russia. Like, I think The majority of these, when you open up to each woman, I think she gets, if there is one available, she gets a full page shot of either a painting or a photograph. I think in the case of Ji Zhangzhu, her story goes too far back, so I don't know that they could find a picture of her, but they included a pirate ship of the era, so you can kind of get an idea. But yeah, there's like Catherine of Russia, which I thought was funny here. They have a quote on her starter page from Catherine that says, "I was very affectionate and gifted with an appearance which was very attractive. I pleased at first glance without employing any arts or pains to that end." It was really humble too. If you're not familiar with Catherine of Russia, she was kind of famous for being married off to this guy that was, he was not really all that bright. He was very immaturish and childlike, even though he was the ruler of Russia. It's more like he didn't realize that there were people's lives under his control. He had his armies, but he would act like he was playing army with them, like they were toy soldiers and he got to set them up. But it's like he wouldn't always think about, like, no, you have a nation you're running. You have to take this seriously. And Catherine would get really frustrated with him because he was like an overgrown child all the time. So she started this sort of plotting, I guess you would call it, to take his place and be the official ruler of Russia. And some of her means were maybe questionable, but she liked to say that everything she did was for the good of the country. Yeah, some of it came into question though. She was impressive. When you read about her as a whole, she was kind of a badass bitch. But unfortunately, a lot of her accomplishments have now been overridden by all these rumors and salacious stories about her supposed sexual deviant side. It's kind of embarrassing that for all she did accomplish, that gets put to the top of the list. But I did think it was kind of funny that even in this history book, they go to that place, because they said, and there's a lot of these little insets in here for like little blurbs that maybe don't fit otherwise, but maybe are interesting to readers. But in this blurb, it says, "During World War II, German troops invading one of Catherine the Great's palaces reported an extraordinary discovery. 4 rooms solely devoted to a collection of erotica, paintings, sculptures, frescoes, chandeliers, and furniture that were all adorned with figurines and motifs engaging in acts that would put the Kama Sutra in the shade. The collection, possibly the largest of its kind in the world, mysteriously disappeared after the war." Did it? The story was kept alive by the same German soldiers, still recounting their discovery to documentary makers 60 years later. So it's just, whether it's true or not, you know, okay, first off, you're gonna shame a woman because she likes sex. Okay, yeah, 4 rooms of porn and erotica might be a bit excessive, but you're gonna shame a woman because she likes sex? That's just, I don't know. I always felt bad for Catherine about that. That being said, she still made some questionable choices. Anyway, moving on. Oh, there's a picture of Rana Valona. Or Rana Valona? I'm not quite sure. Interesting story here. Rana Valona, or Valona, her family was living in or around the palace. Her father and her were both in different ways servants to the king of Madagascar. Her father at one point uncovered an assassination plot against the king and notified the king. And as a sort of thank you, the king officially adopted Rana Valona and took her in as one of his own, highly educated her, you know, gave her everything he would give his own children as far as education and clothes and riches and all of that. When she got to a grown marrying age, he married her off to his favorite son, and everything seemed great, but then it turned out that she was an extreme traditionalist when it came to her culture. When her husband came to power as the new ruler of Madagascar, and she had a bit of power herself, she started ordering executions for anybody that professed belief in any sort of westernized beliefs or Christianity, anything like that. If they were not traditionally Madagascaran beliefs, she would have you executed. And through this process, during her time, she ended up wiping out 1/3 of Madagascar's population. 1/3! So yeah, I think she falls under bad girls. Or crazy bitch, either way. Like I said, they're not all evil in here, but some of them definitely fit the mark. We have Mary Ann Cotton, who was a poisoner of people. Her go-to was arsenic, I believe. Oh, here's a picture of Belle Starr, the sort of female Jesse James of her era. Belle Starr married 2 different outlaw men, and then she also was rumored to have a lot of, she liked to pick Cherokee men as lovers, and it was said that even if the relationship didn't work out, she liked to somehow work her way into keeping some of their land. So you see this picture? This picture is of Belle Starr when she was 22. And then it talks about in here how years later, this picture of Belle Starr gets published in the local newspaper. See how much she's aged there? Well, in the caption there, it says that this photo being published in the paper infuriated her so much, she hunted down the newspaper guy responsible for getting it in the paper and horsewhipped him for posting an unflattering picture. I don't think this lady gets talked about a lot in America. So this is New Zealand's Amy Bach. She was a cross-dressing con woman who, you know, liked to extort money out of people. And in here they talk about one of her worst cons where she actually posed as a man to the point of actually getting engaged to a woman and trying to go through with the wedding in order to get her riches. So yeah, there's a lot of really cool stories in here. A lot of fun stories to pique your interest in history. Another one is also called Bad Girls, but this one is geared more towards YA or maybe older middle grade readers. This is by Jane Yolen and her daughter Heidi Stempel. Jane Yolen you might know as a fantasy writer, but she put together this book with her daughter to tell the stories of some of the most notorious women in history. And this book does cover a lot of the same people that Jan Stridling covered in her book, but there's also a number of different ones to keep it interesting. Jan Stridling's book covers 35 different women. They cover 26 in here, and yeah, like I said, a lot of them overlap if you have both of these. But then this one also looks at women that Jan Stridling didn't cover, like Tituba from the Salem Witch Trials, the Pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Read, Calamity Jane, Lizzie Borden, Ma Barker, Bonnie from Bonnie and Clyde fame, just to name a few. Because this is a partially graphic novel, it is obviously highly illustrated. And what I mean by partially graphic novel is they do it sort of half and half. They have these illustrations here, much like Jan Stridling did in her book, where it starts with the person's name and then like a full page illustration. This, because it is kind of in graphic novel form, this solely relies on artwork, which is done by Rebecca Guay. I'll show you the cover there. He does all the paintings in here. And then you get the actual history book kind of part of it. And the writing is really simplified, easy to understand. Like I said, it feels like it's geared towards like maybe older middle grade into like young YA readers. There are portions at the end of each section that go into like comic panels, graphic novel type panels. The way they set this up in here is they tell you the story of different women throughout history that have really cool stories, and then what the panels are at the end of each section, like this, is it's actually panels of Jane Yolen and her daughter. That's who's in the story. it's just them talking. Jane, like, this is Jane Yolen here, and then the brunette girl is her daughter. It just follows them throughout the course of writing this book. Like, they'll do panels where they go to museums to research, and they're talking about stuff. It'll show them working in their office. This one shows them taking a tour through a country garden at a English estate, I think. This one shows them cooking dinner and talking about the women. And what they do with these panels is they offer their own insight into how they perceive what these women were like, and they show that Jane Yolen and her daughter don't always agree on how they perceive these women, but it does give you an interesting perspective. And one thing I liked about those panels is you're learning about the history of the people, but then with those panels you kind of feel like you're in this conversation with them. You kind of feel like you're sitting in on a book club or something. So I thought that was kind of cool. Oh, speaking of the panels, it's also really funny when you go to the very end here. I think this is the last panel in the book. And what's funny about this panel, let's see if I can zoom in, because you have to kind of look at, oops, okay. You guys see what she's holding? They're at a book signing for the book you're holding. When you're holding this book, which I thought was kind of cool to close the book on that. This one has really cool artwork. Let's see if I can show you some of them here. Like this is a poster that Rebecca Dwyer did for Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the two infamous female pirates. Thought that was pretty cool. I'm just showing you some of my favorites here. There's one for pretty much everybody in the book. This one talked about Catherine the Great again. This was one of my favorites in the book. Oops. This was an illustration of Calamity Jane, which I thought was so cute. I will make a note for parents who are looking for history books that may interest their children. There is one story in here that I would say you may want to do a pre-read on, because I know some parents are particular about how much their children are exposed to at what point in their life. There is a story in here about Salome, the dancer, and it's even titled A Little Strip of a Girl. And if you're not familiar with her story, she is largely known for doing kind of like burlesque dancing, veil dancing, that kind of thing. But the thing with this story is it's talking, the passage opens with this story of her stripping in front of this crowd of people and doing her dance, and they keep talking about sexy Salome and all that. But then they go on to say that when you look at the history of the time and what we do know about the story and everything, in actuality, Jane Yolen says that Salome was in reality probably around 11 or 12 years old and was under the influence of powerful adults who were pushing her into this lifestyle. So yeah, by Jane Yolen's interpretation, we're looking at an 11 to 12-year-old doing this stripping. So, I don't know, there might be some parents that maybe don't want to have that discussion if their kids read this and go, oh, what does that mean when you start stripping at that age? So, I don't know, if that concerned you, maybe do a read through of this. The rest of them are not too bad. But I don't know, that's just my perception. Maybe you want to do a read through of the whole thing and just make sure by your parental standards if it's okay to have your child look at it. Just thought I would mention that. So those are the two history books, I guess. Like I said, I had two history books and one graphic novel, but that was it. That was the other history book that was in graphic novel form. So the only other two I have are the two novels. This first novel I have is kind of an older one. I think this one was originally published in 1964, and it's The Eye of the Lion. It's a novel based on the life of Mata Hari. This is by Lael Wertenbaker. And this is basically what it sounds like. It's a novel based on the life of Mata Hari. This tells her story from 3 different points of view. The story opens with Mata Hari in her voice on the eve of her execution. Mata Hari was executed in 1917 under the suspicion of being a spy or an informant during World War I. So this novel opens with her in her cell just hours before she's about to face the firing squad, and she's sort of looking over her entire life, you know, her early childhood and her adulthood and her children, her marriage and all the choices she made throughout her life that basically got her to the point where we meet her. After she is executed, the story switches over to the the voices of 2 different men who played an important role in one way or another in her life and their perception of her as a woman. Through these 3 voices, we get a more personalized idea of what the woman behind the legend of Mata Hari might have been like. It was more just like a stage persona more than anything. There was an actual woman with kids and an ex-husband and custody battles and, you know, a fear of aging and all of that behind the mythical Mata Hari. But the thing with trying to write a novel about her is she is one of those historical figures that we don't have a lot of irrefutable concrete fact about her. We have a few facts about her, and then everything else is sort of individual perception of how different people interpret things. And we can hypothesize of what she might have been like, but in reality there's just not that known for definitively about her, which when you're writing a historical novel I think could in a way be beneficial, because there's nobody to call you out to say you're wrong necessarily. It's just your perception based off of what you do know. But then it can also be frustrating because you don't know if, because of the lack of information, if you're doing harm to the reputation or memory of the person who actually existed. I don't know, it's a tricky thing. With this book, I liked the voice, I liked the way Wertenbaker did Mata Hari's voice. Mata Hari was her stage name, but she pretty much ended up just going by that through most of her life. But she was born in Holland. I'm not totally sure on the pronunciation of her name, but I think it's something like Margareta or Margareta. And then the last name is Z-E-L-L-E, so I'm not sure if that's Zell or Zelly. I'll put it in a caption so you can see what it looks like, but that was her birth name. And then she married a man named MacLeod, so that became her married name, but most people just know her as Mata Hari. Just for the sake of this video, I'll just refer to her as Mata Hari. So I liked the voice that Wertenbaker gave Mata Hari. And I liked the portions of her story in her voice, and when she's talking about her childhood and her memories of her father and her memories of her own children and how she got into the world of dance and built up her riches and how she got into knowing, you know, government officials and how she got into the spy world and all of that. I liked all of that from her perspective. Then the story sort of dropped off a little bit for me with the 2 other voices. They felt much more dry, much more distanced. And so I have to admit, after Mata Hari's voice tapered off, it's not to say that there wasn't anything good in the book after that. It's just my interest did wane a little bit just because I personally didn't respond as well to the other 2 voices in the book. But if she is a historical figure that that interests you, and you do happen to come across a copy of this somewhere in like a thrift shop or something, which is where I found mine, yeah, give it a go. I wouldn't spend a ton of money on it simply because for me the writing was a little bit dry, it was a little bit dated. it was a little bit of a slog in some places, even though it's kind of a short book. So, yeah, I would say if you can find a used copy somewhere, or if you see it in your library and you're curious about it, maybe check it out, see what you think. But yeah, don't spend a ton of money on this one. But that is a book out there if you're looking for information about her. And then the last one I have to talk about is In Calamity's Wake by Natalie Koppel? I think it's Koppel. This is another historical novel. This book, the author says in here, was inspired by a story Calamity Jane herself used to tell people from time to time about how she bore a child of Wild Bill Hickox, and then later gave it up for adoption. I'm guessing that if that story is true, that he didn't know about it, because I don't know, I would think that would have been in his life story somewhere if it was true. So I don't know, but this book looks at that story and how that might have happened if it were true, what might have happened to that daughter. So in this novel, Jane, whose real name was Martha, does have the daughter, the child, and the daughter is adopted by a man of the cloth who nicknames her Miette, which is the name she goes by throughout the course of this novel. Miette grows up with this church man. I don't know if he's a priest or a pastor, I forget what his actual title is, but a man of the cloth. And on his deathbed, his last request is for her to track down her mother and try to get to know her and make peace with the past, because he knows that Miette has a lot of questions about why. Miette knows who her mother is, but she has a lot of questions about why she was abandoned, why she was given up, why her mother didn't want anything to do with her. At least that's how Miette perceives it. Miette knows all about Jane's reputation and all of that. She herself doesn't really have any interest in meeting her mother, but because this is her adoptive father's last request, she grants him that, and once he passes away, she goes and looks for where Jane might be. And so the bulk of the story is Miette traveling through the Badlands area of the American West and meeting all these different people, this colorful cast of characters. A lot of them are bizarre, some of them are actually kind of dangerous. She meets a guy who claims to be her brother, and then she meets a woman who claims to be Jane herself, which almost snares Miette in, but then the more she talks to this woman, she realizes, no, this woman's kind of mentally unstable and wandering around out in the wilderness. She's like, yeah, I don't think that's my mother. In some circumstances, Miette does actually get physically injured, but then she finds her way out of these situations and eventually makes it to where she heard that Jane was last seen. The longer she gets into it, the more she gets curious about her mother and whether the stories of her mother are true and if there is actually a good woman behind all that. So with this one, I liked the idea of the story. The layout of the novel I was not a total fan of. It jumps around a lot. I think Miette's parts are in first person, but then Martha or Calamity Jane's parts of her story are in mostly third person. And putting Martha's story in third person made it feel very distanced to me. I feel like I would have enjoyed the story better if it was more in alternating first person point of views, like, okay, this chapter's Miette's, this chapter's Martha, but both of them told in first person. I feel like that would have I would have had a better reaction to that. There is one section near the end where there's a letter that is written in Martha's voice, so she does get her chance to have a first person narrative. And that was actually my favorite part of Martha's whole story, which was a shame because when you're reading it, there are actually really interesting images of Martha's story, you know, when they're talking about her, little Calamity Jane is a little girl being sort of tomboyish and scrappy and all that. I liked those stories and how her legend sort of built with everybody she came in contact with. I liked the behind the scenes imagery of that, but yeah, I think because it was told in third person, I feel like there was too much distance. I feel like it would have been even better if Martha could have said it in her own voice rather than, a distanced spectator kind of thing. But there is an afterword in here that kind of talks about the history of Calamity Jane and where the author got some of her ideas. And that letter I'm talking about, Natalie Capel said was inspired by a biographical pamphlet Jane had written and printed up, and she tried to sell near the end of her life to make some extra money when she was kind of low on funds. I thought that was interesting. There's a picture of the actual Calamity Jane here. You've probably seen a million of them, but for those of you that haven't seen her, that's the real Calamity Jane. And the other thing that kind of tripped me up about this book was there's a note at the end of this where Natalie Capel says that this is a work of meta-historical fiction. And I had never heard that term before. And I was like, what the hell is meta-historical fiction? Because I read a lot of historical fiction. It's probably my very top genre that I read from, and I had never heard that term before. So out of curiosity, I did some Googling, and it was interesting because I went through dozens of websites trying to find just a generalized description or definition of what this was. And I'm telling you guys, I read through so many college websites, college papers, books, excerpts, everything, and so many things gave me the impression of that, like, the people that were supposedly experts on this topic didn't even quite know how to just give it to me in layman's terms. And it kind of reminded me of that quote that's often attributed to Einstein where he says, if you can't explain it to a child, you don't know your topic well enough. That's paraphrasing, obviously. But after a long time of trying to sift through this information, because it was bugging me that I couldn't just get a basic definition of this. So I kind of pieced together I could be off on this because I'm still a little bit confused, but I pieced together kind of a general idea of what they were getting at through like I said, dozens of websites. So if you are familiar with this topic and you can add, if you can shed light more on what this is exactly, feel free to explain it as straightforward as you can in the comment section down below. But basically what I gathered from all these different papers I read is it boils down to back in the 1970s, there was this guy, what was his name? Hayden White, who came out and said he proposed that history was more fluid than we're led to believe. A lot of people say that history is concrete. Once it happens, it's happened. You can't change the facts. That's how it went down. Hayden White came out and said, no, it's much more pliable than that. When you look at how history is passed down over the years, that there's, we start with like an oral history, and then even when we get into written history, we're getting our history from how the person saving it, whether it's passing it on orally or writing it down, we're getting their version of it. And that version can be influenced by whatever is going on in that person's personal life at the time. It can be influenced by political or religious climate of the area at the time. There are all these factors that can influence that person's version of history as they're recording it. Like I said, whether it's orally or written. Hayden White threw out this idea of meta-history, which is like the history of history, how we get our history, how that history is influenced by things around it. And so I guess from that concept, came meta-historical fiction, which in theory allows you to sort of, I don't want to say like write what you want, but it opens the door a little bit for interpretation when it comes to historical figures, because with this guy's theories, it's basically saying that, you know, we don't know exactly 100% what happened with these people, because you're getting the versions of history from spectators that were around these people at the time, but that could be tainted. So it gives you leeway to make your own idea of what that person might have been like. Just, that's kind of the concept I get from this. I don't know. Interesting idea. That doesn't change the fact that I found the writing of the book kind of jerky and back and forth. And so while I liked the idea of the story and I liked some of the images she brought up, the writing style was a bit uncomfortable for me, I guess. But I will say with these two novels, the thing that made it worth it for me, between The Eye of the Lion and In Calamity's Wake, even though they had their rough patches for me, they both ended on really nice scenes, and they both had moments near the end that I felt were pretty touching. So they had their moments of good, moments of bad. So again, if it's somebody you're interested in learning more about within historical figures, that could be a book to look into. But again, I will say, this is one I would probably say get it from your library, or if you happen to find it at a used bookstore or thrift store for not too much, maybe try it that way, but don't spend a ton of money on this one either. So that's what I have today for talking about Bad Girls. My stomach is grumbling right now. Hopefully the camera won't catch that, but I guess I should go eat something. So we'll see you next video, guys. Thanks for watching.